All right.
Hi, this is Peggy from WAR. So my guest today is David Carvalho, who's the co-founder and CEO of Naoris. Naoris is a very neat cybersecurity company that is based in Portugal. So David, thank you very much for being here. And before we jump into our questions, do you want to give us a few words regarding Naoris?
Sure. Thank you so much, Peggy. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor. Thank you for allowing me to spend a little bit of time and speak about these important thematics. So Naoris is a cybersecurity company that is bringing the most advanced principles in artificial intelligence, machine learning, blockchain, and also cybersecurity together in order to really achieve a different kind of like next stage approach, let's say, to the way our cybersecurity is thought about and delivered in highly regulated businesses, of course, including finance, fintech, but not just. Really, any environment that is cognizant of the risks out there and wants to mitigate those risks by using their own complexity within the business to their own benefit, blockchain style, should hear about us and should hear about what we offer. In the end, we end up creating a hyper resilient environment within a business that allows for them to find threats that would be, they could be small hacks or malware or anything like this, or abuse by employees internally or externally, even in networks that they don't control. So people working from home, for example, during COVID, and very early on, kind of like prevent breaches that would happen, that would be a conclusion or a consequence of these attacks, maybe down the line, 3-6 months later. So we end up detecting these attacks very, very early on, and we end up mitigating all sorts of threats that could potentially bring the business back to the Stone Age, per se.
Amazing, thank you. And as you mentioned, with COVID, it's become even more relevant with everyone, or pretty much everyone, working from home. So staying on the topic of COVID, we cannot avoid that. So from your perspective, what will be some of the major lasting impacts from the crisis in the financial services industry?
Right. I mean, that's there's quite a lot to say about that, but the lasting impacts, I think, are going to be from various perspectives, like from a competitive perspective. Certainly, environments in the financial space that actually, or companies in the financial space that actually embrace the opportunity that all of these forced disruption gives them, from a technological perspective, transformative perspective, and also capacity to embrace a more globalized digital banking environment in order to increase profits in certain areas where they didn't have, and mitigate certain risks that they now have and before they didn't have, etc., by embracing technological advances. So my point is, like, if they end up embracing these challenges and inducting new innovation principles into their objectives, short-term, medium-term objectives, they have a real opportunity to transform this problematic into a growth paradigm for them. As in, if they are embracing certain technologies, for example, such as machine learning, such as blockchain, such as new approaches on cybersecurity and data assurance, they actually have a huge differentiator compared to their existing, how can I say, partners out there, or competitors, that allows for them to be more aggressive and more competitive in a world where clients are very switched on. They're very switched on technologically. They really value their privacy, their data security, the capability of the business to do what they promise in time efficiently. And I think these technologies that I mentioned before, probably together, bring in completely new capabilities compared to traditional banking that were not really there before. And while these things were maybe kind of like, or these technologies were a bit more optional before, now they actually become more of raison d'être, almost like a reason to be there and be present as a strong, not just competitor, but a strong service provider in the banking space, while providing customers their data security, data assurance that they need, and in a very, very efficient manner. Like, for example, when you look at how certain financial businesses are agilizing certain transactions by using, for example, blockchain methods, making them maybe orders of magnitude faster, cheaper for them, so that they can actually ask less money to customers for a transaction, make them a lot faster, more efficient for the customer without as many requirements or artificial walls in front of the customers. It really makes a difference. For example, monetizing crypto anywhere in the world by purchasing this crypto as the beginning of a transaction that's done by a customer in place A, but then place B or jurisdiction B actually has different rules, but those rules can actually be totally legally circumvented and, quote, quote, of course, following AML and other principles, and just very quickly monetize those funds somewhere else and make that transaction a lot shorter, also while maintaining cybersecurity. That's a huge thing, for example, in that space. But really, the changes that COVID brings to the financial industry or the financial space are also not necessarily, how can I say, positive always, even if there is a large transformation effort. So from a risk perspective, and that's an area that I deal with daily, cyber threats, as it's known, in various domains of cybersecurity or cyber risks, they're actually increasing exponentially in certain cases, other cases quadratically. And as most hackers, they are now home and they actually need to leverage their own capability to live off the land, as it's called. The amount of banking trojans out there and their extent is increasing massively. So that means that a lot more systems in local or hybrid or remote cloud that are actually leveraged by banking environments are being infiltrated, probably using different methods. So certainly a different approach backed by technology on this space is warranted. And I'm sure that if that's not the case, certainly regulators will encroach on these areas. And I think if I was a financial institution, I would probably take care of these earlier rather than later.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. And, I think that's one of the topics that comes back the most regarding that question. The adoption of technology has been accelerated drastically by COVID. The cyber attacks, cyber threats have also increased exponentially. So that's becoming a bit of a cat and mouse game where actually the mouse is moving way faster than the cat. So you talk about regulators, you talked about privacy. So what do you think will be new regulation, new policy that will appear and that might be already appearing in Europe to manage this new normal in financial services?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, always, how can I say, innovation or disruption? In any case, in this case, it's not innovation; it's actually a forced disruption that brings its own risks from various areas. These innovations or disruptions always bring in changes in regulation. So regulation always comes after. And of course, if companies want to innovate, they will be taking a certain risk also in terms of, probably maybe some regulations that will push them in a different direction potentially, but they also have a lot of opportunities of actually leveraging an area of the market that before wouldn't be leveraged, and actually being the first ones there and gaining from these kind of like inflation promise that occurs from there in terms of profits. So in this case, due to the massive impact of the pandemic, this is to be expected. Of course, on the cybersecurity spaces, I expect from being an ex-auditor, I expect things that, like for example, the implementation of new, for example, standards or compliance principles around the distributed security of systems, for example. So currently, most of the threats actually come from third-party environments. Be it cloud providers or just service providers of any kind that a regulated business such as a bank, for example, would have. That would be in the hundreds, if not thousands. So actually maintaining visibility and assurance and knowledge that all SLAs from a cybersecurity perspective and other perspectives, best practice, etc., are actually being followed not just from a, for example, software development lifecycle, if it was a provider of, for example, development, but any other perspective, from network security, from best practices around, operating system security and access management security, etc. There are no current systems that allow for that, but actually the technology is available to implement such things. That's something that my company does also as a kind of like a byproduct of what it already does on cybersecurity. So the validation of SLAs, best practices, these cybersecurity principles, even outside of your own networks. So from a principle of actually bringing trust into trustless environments that normally don't trust each other and they have no visibility of each other, actually certain technologies that we end up using allow for the occurrence of these without any auditor needing to be present, and actually looking at these systems, which in the end, as you know, this area is actually very faulty. I mean, usually an auditor would go and do an audit on best practice, for example, in a third party. And let's say the third party has 20,000 devices and, I don't know, 1,000 servers. This auditor will look at 3 or 4 computers and do 4 or 5 interviews, and that's it. All the other 99.99% of the environment wouldn't be reviewed. So I firmly believe that in order to deal with the challenges that we're having today with cybersecurity because of the pandemic, because of all the new risks that have increased exponentially, as we mentioned before, these are going to become certainly principles of compliance that highly regulated spaces, not just finance spaces, but others will have to follow. I'm thinking about critical infrastructure and other environments that are, of course, at the basis of society's operations. Again, kind of like part of a longer conversation, but I believe this is going to happen, and it's hard to ignore that. Yeah.
So do you think, because I absolutely agree with you that we're going to see, and we should see actually, we should have already seen in the past tighter measures from regulators in that aspect. I think it's a big miss and it's a big risk. Working with tons of fintechs, and you're very, very obviously plugged in the ecosystem. Do you think it's becoming a barrier to entry for small organizations that work with regulated industry like financial services? Because obviously you need to have way more capital to put in place all these measures to work with large organizations. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, certainly it is a barrier to entry. Organizations that are already there and already went through, how can I say, these pain points that usually also require a certain level of investment from their side, just to be quote unquote compliant, even though if this compliant is just a traditional form of compliant, you still need to pay quite a bit of money, and it doesn't really matter much in the end, but you have a stamp. It's better than nothing. Yes, it is better than nothing. But as you say, currently these technologies that are coming up, that, transformation in business, sure, it's fueled by people and method, but that is always underlined by technology. And that is always going to be like the big, how can I say, lever that is going to push businesses forward. It's when there are, transformations either in protocol or operations or whatever. In this case, it's really maintaining secure operations. It's maintaining secure operations while you innovate, while you transform, either because that's mandated because of some compliancy rule, that's coming from some regulator, or because you have to, due to, outside pressures, competitor pressures, other pressures like we're seeing right now with the pandemic. And the sort of technologies that I'm talking about actually allow for smaller businesses or medium-sized businesses to actually come into these highly regulated environments from a perspective that, doesn't need to, fit some of these rules. And the reason for that is because certain protocols and network approaches that occur, for example, at blockchain level, can actually operate without knowing information about data. So you can actually have access to data, and you can validate that data as being correct, and the whole ecosystem can assure that data is correct without knowing what data that is. So mathematically speaking, there is a thing called ZK SNARKs, or zero proof of knowledge, where you can actually do that cryptographically, which is a very smart technology that allows actually an outside business to come in and provide a service without necessarily being subservient to all of these barriers of entry while providing a really important service for the other side, right? And I think that's, not necessarily the prize doesn't go to the regulators because they did a good job. The prize goes to technology because it allows for that, right? Under the regulators' remit, right? We're still following the rules, and we're actually providing something that's beneficial for the regulator and the client at the same time. Normally, and many times, the client doesn't necessarily love the regulator. The regulator has completely different objectives than the client has. But in the end, in this case, I think both benefit by ending up, bringing companies that could be, not big companies that don't have that big barrier to entry exactly because of the technologies they use to come in and do this. And everybody benefits from this. So I think the barriers to entry are actually decreasing. There's a bigger democratization of, managed service providers of various areas, from security to compliance to assurance. And I think that's really good overall, given the current threats out there.
Yeah, I agree with your assessments. If we take a step back and we look at the world as it is today, obviously a lot of instability, political, fiscal, obviously health. We see a lot of debt that has been built up by governments. We see obviously, global pandemic, nationalism, we've seen terrorist attack here in Europe and from France. I mean, things are not really going on the up and up. What do you think this new financial order, or this new global order will be? We are talking a bit offline about Europe and the fact that it should be a bigger power than it is right now if they can put their shit together. What's your perspective on that? What do you want to share?
Oh boy. So currently, as you mentioned, I mean, due to a lot of global instability, backed by, geopolitical reasons, financial reasons, financial pressures due to COVID. I mean, you have most of the economies, or at least advanced economies right now, contracting anywhere from 10 to 30% or even more, which is unheard of. It's kind of like a once in a century situation. Hopefully, we won't see this again.
Yeah.
The consequences of such things are absolutely immense. So they are titanic consequences. I mean, both in terms of geopolitical impacts, inflationary pressures, huge impact in terms of trust and resilience backbones of these environments. I mean, I'm talking about, right now, due to all these pressures, I mean, as you say, the world order, and call it whatever you want, is changed. It's hard to go back, to where we were before, about maybe 4 years ago or something like that. Especially when you look, for example, at some, how can I say, cultural or political pressure changes that are happening, for example, with your neighbor in the south or here in Europe or in other locations in the world that have real global, cultural, financial, political, geopolitical impacts. And if you look at all of that, the digital infrastructures that back that, those economic systems, those service systems, from healthcare to basic services in society that everybody needs, are being impacted. They are being impacted at so many levels. It's almost hard to, it's easy to have a start, but it's hard to have an ending on that conversation. But I think that because so many people are basically forced to be home and forced to be outside of their jobs, either temporarily or completely, the pressure is even stronger than we were before. So many countries were not stable before this, and now they're a lot less stable. And as you were mentioned, for example, in Europe, it's a good example. I mean, I live in Europe, and the society pressures are huge in governments. It's very hard to govern in Europe right now. There's just generalized discontent with certain things that are fundamental to society, right? And then you also have very strong political pressures in very different directions that are, backed by different cultures, different how can I say, ways of living and seeing pressures and difficulties that societies are having across Europe, and it's very hard to have consensus. At European level, and without consensus, pretty much nothing happens on the European Union. So kind of like taking a little bit to the side these kind of like geopolitical and social concerns. If you look at financial, the financial industry, and even looking at, for example, core services like, for example, national exchanges, or how central banks are going to cope with it because of inflation pressures, etc. The risks that exist in these areas from how can I say, a more warlike situation, including cybersecurity related woes, is huge. It is increasing, I think, at the same pace, if not faster. Those risks are increasing when compared to, for example, just enterprise, as I was mentioning to you before. So these kind of like outside of the norm attacks that we see to infrastructure, to national services that are coming from other regional or global powerhouses at nation state level that don't really have a defense, that are very well backed, financially and also technologically, are going to increase, and they are already increasing. So it's very important that not just how can I say, nation states and their policies adapt to this quickly, but also that businesses do, in order for them to increase their defenses, their participation, let's say, and the awareness of their people, so that everybody is an active participant in their own protection, the protection of their infrastructures that they need to do business, the backbones of financial backbones. I'm talking about SWIFT, for example, in other environments that now are even at more risk than before, because obviously you have a number of nation states that want to discredit that because that benefits them over time because of sanctions or whatever. Mm-hmm. And also you have other partners before that were there quite strongly on that space that are now more focused on other problems, more internal problems maybe, and are doing less coordinating. I mean, from my perspective, at advising nation states on what to do around cyber war, cyber terrorism, cyber espionage, in environments such as those that tend to be very critical for how can I say, just informed decision making at nation state level. I think right now it's a very hot moment for that. Yeah. And I believe that really not enough attention is being given to these threats, to the detriment of the countries in general that are under more risk. And these tend to be the countries that also have, at the same time, a higher probability of general, how can I say, social issues that just from the risk of COVID.
Yeah, which obviously has a risk of compounding, but I absolutely agree with you. The global financial order is at risk with these cyber attacks, and to your point, attacks that are financed by rogue states that are extremely savvy, well financed, well equipped, and I think people are slowly waking up to that. But I mean, you want to be on your front foot, not your back foot. Seems like we're very much on our back foot in that situation. So that's definitely something I personally think is as worrying, if not more worrying than a pandemic. Because if you have a run on your banks because you have so many attacks, and people lose trust in their institution, you can end up in a repeat of 2008 while the economy is already so fragile because of COVID. So that could really be a very, very poor situation. You mentioned in your first question some new competitive positioning and the fact that organizations that are embracing technologies and accelerating their use for the client's sake will be the ones that will be successful. If I'm putting my large financial institution at? I know you work with a lot of banks, a lot of large organizations. What do you see in terms of transformation traditional FI going through at this time?
I see that, large institutions, like everything always, this has always been true, in nature, in society, it has been always a truism. Whatever is small today will be big tomorrow, and whatever is big today will be small tomorrow in some fashion. So I think, obviously a large financial institution has a lot of inherent supposed stability, or at least perceived stability. It's not unheard of that the large financial institution just kind of like disappears because of some disaster, right? Either regulatory disaster or other kinds of disasters. That's not unheard of, but certainly it would increase their capability to their standing power, really, to observe how savvy their users are becoming, especially in a lockdown world, in terms of like looking at other competitors and I can speak about myself even directly. So for example, when I deal with bank accounts, for example, it's a lot easier for me, and I know to all my friends, if you actually don't need to go to some place to get the stamp and stay in the queue. Like, what's the point of doing that? This is something that, I'm not saying, I'm not the youngest generation there is. I'm certainly somewhere in the middle. But they will have a very different approach to that. And I think in general, people at the moment cannot do that. They're not willing to do that, but the requirements are still there. So if the requirements are still there, certainly some banks can do it. As in, you adopt certain technologies, you kind of like, you go around these traditional bureaucratic pressures, and you allow for everything to be a lot more agile and for people to do everything that they need to do from home with a couple of clicks and using their their biometrics from their phone. They have the camera, they have the print, they have a fingerprint, they have all these things. Actually, I believe that for large institutions, I think they are even at more risk than the smaller institutions because they are less nimble to deal with these pressures. So I think they should definitely look at that with, how can I say, with eyes of interest, let's say, because we are in a much more digital heavy world right now than we were a year ago. Just because people were forced to. And I'm talking about, for example, let's say my parents, and they are obviously a lot older than me, and they do things in a very different way, right, than I do. And they think in a different way than I do. But I felt that, especially regarding, for example, traditional banking systems and so on, where they're actually used to look at, for example, their savings or their loans or whatever in a traditional manner. Okay, I need to go to the bank, I need to talk to this person, I need to talk to that person to do this, but they can't do that now. So they're actually coming to me, just like probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people are coming to their sons and daughters or whatever at different ages and saying, hey, can I do this differently? And I'm going to say, yeah, you just download that app and you do these A, B, and C things, and you're done, and don't need to go to any queue, and you don't need to, I don't know, prove that, this is really your blood and so on and so forth. Right? So you kind of like, you don't need to go through all those hoops to actually do something that for us is simple, that we do all the time, but they don't do all the time. So speaking about, for example, small institutions like in Canada, actually it was mentioned, one of them in a previous video of yours. So the capability of large businesses to continue on, and the financial businesses to continue on their position of dominance is being threatened exactly by the hyper normalization of digital systems, right? And their view that is a lot more traditional and kind of like in person and slow. People now, and this is, I think, across the board, they want something simple, cheap, fast, efficient, that protects their data from beginning to end, that they're assured of it. So they need to see that happening, right? They don't just want to use a password. They want to make sure there's a fingerprint there somewhere and maybe other things, right? So I think big institutions like that, as you mentioned, they need to embrace that. And I think this is like one of the last wake up calls that probably they will have. Um,
Yeah. Mhm.
Especially as you have small fish in banking kind of like gobbling up global markets in certain niches because they can, and then you have very traditional giants that are becoming kind of like smaller and smaller and smaller within their own specific you know geographic region because they cannot see outside of their bubble, right? So yeah, that's my 2 cents for large financial organizations and what you said.
That's interesting because I believe like you, a lot of people, the generation of maybe your parents or maybe people who are maybe less savvy. I'm 43. I have girlfriends who are still lining up to go to the banks. So you still
That's
have
right.
non-tech savvy people who are in their 40s, but that's not going to come back once you learn how to do it. You're not going to put yourself back in a queue now that you know to do it on your phone. So that's done. Um, so last question for you, the lightest question of them all. So in this last 6 months, you've had the pretty serious lockdowns in Portugal. What have you done? Did you pick up good habits? Did you learn new things, both personally or for your business? I know you're listening to tons of audiobooks. What's the new David during or post-COVID?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so I think everybody has their own personal story in regards to this. My own is kind of like, okay, there are good things and bad things that come out of this. The bad things are obvious and everywhere to be seen, and they are not to be taken lightly. But the good things are, for example, I was making, and I love my life. Don't get me wrong, but I was making around 190 to 100 flights a year, speaking in conferences, going to events, so on and so forth. And the fact that I'm not doing that now and that I can actually devote time to my project and my family and the people that I love and being close to them, this definitely has immense value.
Mhm.
I don't think that would happen if the pandemic wouldn't happen. So there are always bads that come, that end up bringing some good things. Fortunately, everybody has been keeping healthy and secure. But in my life, in my personal life, it's funny you ask that. Like I usually say to people, I am one of the most paranoid people that they would know. And I don't mean paranoid as in like I'll put a strange hat on top of my head, but I'm talking about like from a risk perspective across the board. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's pandemics, if it's cyber risks, whatever it might be. I'm always and I have always been a very strong risk mitigator, let's say. So I always have a plan, and I always have a backup plan and another one that is encrypted somewhere. So my life didn't change that much, which is kind of like a strange thing to say.
Yeah.
I still maintain all kind of like my principles in check. And so what changed really was in the need that I didn't have before, to actually see people face to face and to meet with them face to face, because I have nothing against Zoom, but I'm really, really tired
Yeah.
of doing Zoom calls, where people are forced like to look for 1 hour at the camera, or else they are not polite. If they are not, even if they are not saying anything, right? So there's definitely something strange about that. When you're in a meeting, you're allowed to look around and do things.
Yeah.
So, so it's a strange thing that you actually have to surrender to. I still read a lot of audiobooks. Nothing changed on that principle, but overall it has been, there's always something good that comes from something bad. In this case, the opportunity was to catch up with work that I was having difficulty to catch up with due to the nature of my life, always on the move, kind of like lobe throttler principle, let's say. Right now I am very happy that I have one of my servers from our cloud in our home. I can do all sorts of things that I couldn't before. I can get a lot of work done in various kind of like technologies that before would be hard to deal with, especially on the move. More kind of like hardcore stuff, especially around, for example, malware reverse engineering and things like that, geeky things like that, that are important for me. Yeah. Otherwise, everybody that is important in your life, and I think in mine too, probably still maintains in contact, right? The people that are really your friends are still going to be your friends. They are still going to talk to you even if they are far away. So I haven't lost anything there, I think. So generally, I'm positive about the whole thing. I just hope that, as we mentioned before, the very important questions that we talked around these interview. Just in closing, I wanted to say that just as the pandemic has forced us to accept it, to change behaviors and thought processes, we must also aggressively adapt, and really grab that opportunity that it provides us. So I would just leave that one, for food for thought or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
Yeah, grabbing the opportunity in every crisis. I think that's where. Well, I would say we are in a probably extremely privileged position to be able to think that way. When you're in survival mode, well, it's a bit more difficult to think about, okay, what is the opportunity I can see, because you're trying to live another day. But I think, again, with our position, if we are not ourselves looking at, okay, what can I learn? How can I make this better? Well, who's going to do it? So thank you so much, David, for taking the time and for your insight. That was really a pleasure to chat. Always a pleasure to chat anyway. But thank you so much for taking the time. Have a great day.
Thank you too, Peggy. A pleasure. Take care.
Thank
See
you.
you next time.
Bye.